You are listening to MCC Votes and Seats, the podcast series of the Center for Political Science of Mathias Corvinus Collegium. We provide election insights with experts and politicians.
Welcome everyone. You are listening to the new episode of the Votes and Seats podcast series of the Center for Political Science at Mathias Corvinus Collegium. My name is Janik, senior researcher of the center. The second round of the Polish presidential election was held on the 1st of June with Rafał Trzaskowski and Karol Nawrocki, resulting in a narrow victory of the latter. What was the stake of the election? What processes does the result imply? What are the possible consequences for the right and the left in Poland? And I have the honor to discuss these and similar questions with Alex Szczerbiak, professor of politics and head of department at the University of Sussex. Professor, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. So, the election held 1 month ago showed that how divided and polarized the Polish society is. How do you assess the outstanding turnout exceeding 21%? And generally speaking, what was the stake of this election for the average voter, if there's any average voter?
So you're absolutely right. It was a very high turnout. It was the highest ever in a Polish presidential election, and the second highest in any Polish election since 1989, only slightly below the record turnout in October 2023. And I think one of the things political science teaches us is that elections turnout is high when people think that there is a lot at stake and when they think the result is going to be very close. And I think that explains what you said about Poland being very divided and very polarized, very divided down the middle and very polarized between the two sides, really helps to explain that very high turnout. I mean, basically, I think you've got two very sort of different visions of Poland at stake, going back to very fundamental things like what was the nature of the transition from communism to democracy, what are the kind of the elites and the institutions that have emerged from it, how legitimate are they? These very significant divisions about the nature of the Polish state map onto socioeconomic divisions. So on the one side, you've got people who are better off, live in urban areas, better educated, better off professions. On the other side, you've got less well-off voters who live in rural areas, less well-educated. And all of this maps onto differences in terms of what you might call moral cultural issues. So you've got differences in terms of issues like, very divisive issues like abortion, state recognition of same-sex couples, which often intertwines with religiosity, how often people go to church, and what their views are of the role of Christian values, Catholic Church in public life. And increasingly, this also maps onto differences in terms of Poland's position internationally, and particularly the role that it should play within the European Union. So the two sides, the kind of, I suppose if you like, the liberal centrist side and the kind of insurgent right-wing conservative side are very divided. They knew it was going to be very close, both sides, and this really encourages people to turn out. And of course, just as in 2023, it was a major choice about the direction which Poland is going to go. In a sense, this time it was a kind of a rerun of that, and the key issue at stake was, would the government that was elected in 2023 be able to implement its program unimpeded? So in a sense, everybody said that 2023 was the most important election since 1989. Well, it was until this election, which is now once again the most important election in 1989. And that, and the fact that Poland is so polarized, so divided, and because the two sides are so evenly balanced, explains why there was such a high turnout.
You just said that this voting was all about the confirmation of the Tusk government's policies and whether they can keep on their agenda, go ahead with their reforms. And analysts, commentators foresee the cabinet to have an extremely hard time in its remaining terms, since Nawrocki is expected to use his presidential veto and constitutional control right very extensively, more frequently than Duda, who actually didn't use it or hasn't used it that often. Something that Nawrocki himself is also mentioned in his campaign. How do you see, generally speaking, what will be Nawrocki's role perception? Like how active he will be in domestic politics?
Well, it's very interesting because Karol Nawrocki is, of course, not a politician by background. He's a historian. He was the head of the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, a historical institute. Indeed, he was deliberately chosen by Law and Justice because he wasn't associated with the previous Law and Justice government. Law and Justice wanted to make this election a referendum about the current government, not about the previous government, which is what Mr. Tusk's administration was trying to make it about. But in spite of that, I think he's actually going to be a very political president. He's a very different personality to Andrzej Duda. Andrzej Duda was a Law and Justice politician to his fingertips. I mean, there was no doubt which side of the political divide he was on. But he also made lots of attempts to try and act in a kind of more conciliatory way, in a more open way with the opposition. He tried not to be painted as a partisan president. Sometimes he actually even vetoed important pieces of legislation that the Law and Justice government had promoted. Karol Nawrocki is a much tougher, more uncompromising character who I think will be much less bothered about being liked. He will do what he thinks is necessary, and if that means bringing himself into conflict with the government, I don't think he's going to have any problems with that at all. I mean, having said that, he's not just going to veto every law as it comes. I mean, whatever his views are, it's not in his interests to be seen as a president who just kind of blocks everything. I mean, this will give the government a good way of sort of counter mobilizing. I mean, they'll be able to say, well, we can't get anything done because we've got this president who just on principle blocks everything we do. So I think he's actually going to be quite careful and quite selective. And so I think the areas where, he will definitely block the government will be its attempts to unravel Law and Justice's judicial reforms. This is a key element of the government's legislative program. In particular, they basically don't recognize the judges that were appointed since Law and Justice's reforms were introduced in 2018. This is about a third of Poland's judges, and it wants to find various ways of removing them. Mr. Nawrocki has made it clear that he is not going to pass any legislation that undermines the status of those judges who are actually appointed by a president. They were appointed by his predecessor, Mr. Duda. So, that I think is an absolute red line. And I think, the government, if it wants to find ways of changing that, it's going to have to do something else. There are other areas where, I mean, almost regardless of what Mr. Nawrocki does, the government isn't going to be able to get things through. And it's not really to do with the veto. I mean, for example, the question of liberalizing the abortion law. I mean, this is something that the government is committed to, and Mr. Nawrocki would veto legislation if they proposed it. But actually, the reason that this has not been passed is not because of presidential veto. They simply haven't been able to agree among themselves. The more conservative elements of the coalition and the Peasant Party have blocked attempts to liberalize the abortion law, and have also done the same with things like trying to have state recognition of same-sex couples. So, part of this is to do with government divisions among themselves. There are other areas where I think he'll quite simply support what the government does. Indeed, he will actually put them under some pressure to implement their legislative program. And I think on socio-economic questions, this is one of those areas. I mean, Mr. Duda, didn't veto much of the legislation that they proposed on these issues. Indeed, a lot of it was actually continuing the policies of the Law and Justice government on things like welfare benefits. But he has, for example, Mr. Nawrocki has, for example, said that he will propose a law substantially increasing tax allowances, which was one of Civic Platform's key election promises, which not only have they not fulfilled, but they haven't actually set out any kind of timetable for fulfilling it. So he actually, will propose something that is one of their policies in order to put pressure on them. So although he'll be a very, very tough cookie, he'll be very difficult for the government to deal with. His project is for Law and Justice to to win the 2027 election, he won't just veto things as they come. He'll also use other instruments that he's got to put pressure on the government. He can call the meeting what's called the Cabinet Council. This is a meeting of the government which he chairs, which he said he'd made it clear he would do if the government didn't resolve the immigration crisis on the Polish-German border. He can introduce legislation himself, which he said he will do. He'll introduce legislation to implement a big infrastructure project, the Central Communications Port, which the government, he argues, is dragging its feet on and isn't really committed to. And I think more importantly than anything else, his election has changed the political dynamics. It's really put the government on the back foot because, as I say, it was pitched as a referendum on the government, and the government lost and Mr. Nawrocki won. And unlike Mr. Duda, who was having to deal with this government at the end of his presidential term, okay, Mr. Nawrocki has a fresh mandate. Okay, he has lots of people who voted for him, and he explicitly asked people to vote for him if they weren't happy with the government. So in many ways, much more than the kind of the formal things like the veto or tribunal referral, it's the change in the political dynamic and the way that the government is really now on the back foot and facing a president with this huge electoral mandate that I think is really going to make it difficult for them.
Sticking to the cabinet's current position, just the day right after the election, Tusk initiated a confidence vote in the Sejm, which he managed to survive, receiving all the support he needed, and so no one deserted from the coalition. What motivated, what do you think, this risky move, and what kind of political processes can unfold on the governing party side in the coming period? If you look at the parties in the coalition.
Yes. So I think the move was essentially about buying time. I think that there was immediately after the election, the coalition partners started play the blame game. There was even some voices, I mean, not many, but some voices actually saying that Mr. Tusk had to go. They were arguing that his intervention in the election campaign was counterproductive for the Civic Platform candidate. So by calling a confidence vote, which he knew that the parties would rally around and vote for. There wasn't really any danger of this. He was able to kind of calm things down a bit within the coalition, and to some degree, at least, to regain the initiative. But all it's done, I think, to buy him time. Really, now the government has to work out a plan B, if you like. It didn't seem to have one. Its strategy seemed to be predicated on the idea that its candidate, Rafał Trzaskowski, would win, and it didn't really seem to have a plan about what to do if he lost. So it's kind of making this up on the hoof a little bit. At the moment, the government seems to be concentrating on trying to improve its communication with voters. So they've appointed a new government speaker, a government spokesperson, which was one of the demands of the junior coalition partners. There's also talk about restructuring the government. Some talk about, making it smaller. The problem with this is that there's only any point having a good communication strategy if you know what you're communicating. You need to work out, what the government should comprise, who should be in it, what the structure would be, when you know what your program is, what your aims are, what your message is, what your mission is. And I think the big problem that the government has got is that, this is not very clear, basically. Mr. Tusk is somebody he's a very good tactician. He's very good at putting his opponents on the back foot, at taking initiatives that, dominate the news agenda for a couple of days, and then he moves on from them. And at the moment, what the government needs is not more sort of clever tactical initiatives to win a news cycle. It's to restore its sense of purpose. And in the absence of that, it's spending a lot of time looking inwards. I mean, spending a lot of time talking about what the composition of the government should be, what the share of government ministries should be. And this is not what voters want to hear. Voters want governments that are interested in them and not in themselves. Having said all that, I think that there are two things that are worth bearing in mind. The first one is I think the governing coalition will hold together, and quite probably until the next election scheduled for autumn 2027. I mean, one reason for that is because one of the glues that holds all political formations and governments together in Poland is access to state appointments, to state patronage. And if they were to break up the government, they would almost certainly lose the election. And if they were to do that, they would lose access to all of these state appointments. And that doesn't just mean, people in ministries. It means, going right down sort of government agencies, state-owned companies, all that kind of thing. There's a huge network here. And that is a glue that holds governments together. And I think this will hold this government together. The fact that, this government will be no different from any others. It's why governments are able to survive for a long time, even when they have very small majorities. The other thing to bear in mind is that, of course, it is a long time until the next election. It's over 2 years, and a lot can change in politics. I mean, it would be a complete fool to predict the outcome of an election in, 2 months' time, never mind in 2.5 years' time. So, an enormous amount can change. The problem, I think, is that in order for that to change for the government, they have to change the political dynamic. They have to change the story. And I can't see any evidence that they've got an idea how to do that. I mean, they might have one and they've got time to think it up, but unless they can change that political dynamic, they are heading towards defeat in 2027. They've got plenty of time to think about ways of doing it, but if they just drift on at the way that they're doing, they will almost certainly lose.
And turning to the other side of the political spectrum, with Nawrocki's win, Kaczynski will likely stabilize his position within PiS. And in the short run, and as well as the party's position on the right, something maybe he can exploit and build on in preparation for the 2027 election. However, the Confederation's good performance and the pretty high popularity among the youth should be seen maybe as a warning sign for Kaczynski and his party. What dynamics can unfold and shape the power relations on the right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it speaks to one of the bigger interesting questions which is raised by this election result. I mean, on the one hand, relating to the first question you asked me, the fact that there is such a high turnout, the fact that people are, mobilizing around this divide that there is between civic platform and law and justice suggests that, people identify with it, that it actually connects with real social constituencies. On the other hand, this was an election where in the first round of voting, the lowest number of votes were actually cast for the candidates of the two main parties for many elections, just over 60%. It's actually the lowest vote. And if you drill down, as you've done correctly, to look at younger voters, actually only about 23% of younger voters voted for either Law and Justice or for Mr. Nawrocki or Mr. Trzaskowski, the Law and Justice and Civic Platform candidates. The largest share of the vote was, as you say, won by the radical right Confederation Party. And also worth noting is that the second largest share of the vote was won by the radical left Together Party, which is not part of the governing coalition. It's obviously not on the political right, but it also stood in opposition to the current government and also to the government bipolar divide. And this raises questions about, the durability of this bipolar divide as the organizing principle of Polish politics, but it raises a very specific question for Law and Justice, as you say. And I think the issue here is that I think it's going to be, Confederation is here to stay, basically, or certainly until the next election. They're going to get about 15% of the vote. It looks like they're, fairly steadily on that. It's going to be very difficult for Law and Justice to win a majority at the next election on its own, like it did in 2015 and 2019. In order to govern, it's going to need to form a broader alliance, and the obvious partner for that, the only obvious partner for that, is the Confederation. So really, these two parties are almost destined to be coalition partners. And for Law and Justice, it's got to kind of come to terms with the fact that it's not the absolute hegemon on the right. And one really interesting thing here is that if you look at the constituency that Confederation is mobilizing, these are young voters, but also they're very, very different to the kind of people that are the core Law and Justice constituency. So they're young voters for a start. Law and Justice voters tend to be older. But also, Law and Justice voters are actually quite left-wing on socio-economic issues. They're in favour of state intervention into the economy. They're in favour of, welfare, large welfare benefits, a welfare state. Confederation voters are much more free market. Okay, they're much more in favour of lower taxes. They're not in favour of, a large state. And they're also relatively socially liberal. Okay, and very secular. Okay, the fastest growing group of non-religious voters in Poland are younger voters. Okay, whereas one of the key characteristics of the Law and Justice constituency is, these are older voters, they live in rural areas, and they're very religious as well. And the Confederation voters are not. And indeed, they're actually quite socially liberal on issues like abortion, their attitudes towards same-sex marriage and state recognition of same-sex partnerships, but also very anti what you might call the woke left on what you might call freedom of speech issues. Okay, they hate anything that's perceived of as censorship, which is why they don't vote for the left, basically. So this is a very interesting new constituency. They're young, they're quite free market, they're quite socially liberal, and they're not very religious. They're what I call the secular right. That's my kind of working title for them. And Law and Justice this is a really important constituency. If the right wants to win the next Polish election, okay, these are going to be the key voters. These were key in terms of Karol Nawrocki's victory in this election. The fact that 85–90% of Confederation voters, Mr. Menson's voters, voted for him, and they will be absolutely critical if Law and Justice wants to win the next parliamentary election. It cannot win on its own.
Moving on to foreign policy issues and the role Nawrocki could take in the future. The Polish president is traditionally an important actor in shaping the country's international relations, pushing his own agenda, etc. Will Nawrocki's foreign policy line be different from that of Duda? Can there be any clashes between him and Tusk or Sikorski in foreign issues? What do you think?
Well, the first thing to say is that just as the president isn't involved in the day-to-day governance of the country, although they have important constitutional instruments like the veto, foreign policy is made by the government. Okay. So, on a day-to-day basis, the Polish foreign policy won't change as a result of the presidential election. However, the fact that he has this enormous mandate means that the president can insert themselves in particular debates in a very powerful way. And this is particularly the case on foreign policy and security issues. The Polish president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which obviously means that what they say on security questions has a particular weight in those kind of debates. It's very often the president represents the Polish government at NATO summits, for example, as Andrzej Duda did last week. The president does have some important constitutional instruments. However, one of them is to the appointment of ambassadors. Okay, ambassadors can't be appointed to without the president's consent, which means, for example, that Poland currently doesn't have an ambassador to the United States. Its nominee, Bogdan Klich, who's a former Civic Platform minister, is a chargé d'affaires. It's a lower diplomatic rank. Mr. Duda refused to accept him, and Mr. Nawrocki has also made it clear that he will not appoint Mr. Klich. He says that he's somebody who's been too critical of the Trump of Mr. Trump and wouldn't be a good person to build those relations. So, although again, the day-to-day foreign policy is made by the government, the president is what they say is relevant. They can insert themselves into this debate, particularly on security issues. I think the biggest difference between Mr. Nawrocki and Mr. Duda is probably to do with their approach to Ukraine, but I think you're going to ask me a separate question on that. So I'll come on to that. I think that the main thing to note, is that actually they're very similar in terms of their, beyond certain issues, in terms of their approach to foreign policy. So, for example, they're both quite Eurosceptic, not in the sense that they want Poland to leave the EU. There's no real debate about that in Poland, but in terms of they don't support deeper European integration on issues like climate policy, migration policy, or indeed on security issues, like they don't support the development of a European defence identity outside of NATO. Indeed, both of them are very Atlanticist. Both of them enjoyed, really good relations with Donald Trump. Andrzej Duda has had excellent personal relations with Donald Trump, and Mr. Nawrocki had a photo opportunity during the presidential election in the Oval Office, where Mr. Trump correctly said you would win. It is good call in terms of a prediction. And this is a contrast, I think, to the current government, which doesn't enjoy, has very problematic relations with the Trump administration because of very critical comments that members of the Tusk government have made. I mean, indeed, Mr. Tusk himself, who at one point suggested that Mr. Trump was a Russian security service asset. So I think that, there will be some differences. Obviously, he's got a different style, as we've discussed before. But in broad terms, I think, there's going to be continuity between Mr. Duda and Mr. Nawrocki, and both of them broadly operate within that kind of law and justice framework in terms of their approach to European, transatlantic and foreign relations more generally.
Professor, your forecast was right. And now turning to Ukraine, to me personally, it seems like Nawrocki's communication on Ukraine is a bit different, slightly different from that of Duda. He seemingly takes a more pragmatic approach, emphasizes Polish interests more explicitly. Can you imagine major or any changes in this regard in the new president's position?
Yeah, I think this is another very interesting question. I think that I think the first thing to get it out the way is continuity and what's similar. So I think that Karol Nawrocki supports Ukraine in conflict against Russia. There's absolutely no doubt about that. He's fully committed to providing diplomatic, military, humanitarian support to, Poland being, a major hub for providing all of these things. He sees it, as do the great bulk of Polish politicians, as overwhelmingly in Poland's strategic interests that Ukraine should either win the war or come out of it with a peace settlement on favorable terms as possible. And he believes that both Poland and Ukraine have a very common view of Russia's agenda in the former Soviet Union and former Soviet states, and are both opposed to what they see as Russian expansion. There isn't really a pro-Putin lobby in Poland, and Mr. Nawrocki certainly can never be accused of being in that camp. There is actually an arrest warrant out against him in Moscow. He's persona non grata there because of some of the things he did as chair of the Institute of National Remembrance. So here, there's not going to be any change. Poland will still be a strong ally of Ukraine internationally. The difference, I think, is that whereas Mr. Duda tended to support Ukraine fairly unconditionally, I think that Mr. Nawrocki's approach will be more instrumental. And I think that what he will argue, and this is actually very much in line with where Law and Justice's thinking has been going on this. Mr. Duda's a bit of an outlier here, really, on this compared with his own party, is the argument that while on this big issue of Russian expansion, we are, Poland and Ukraine have similar interests. Okay, we are allies on this. There are also lots of issues where Poland and Ukraine have different interests. Okay, historical issues, for example. The two countries have very different assessments of the role of Ukrainian nationalists during the Second World War, particularly their involvement in what's called the Wołyń massacre, which Poles refer to as a genocide, and the Ukrainians use a very different narrative to describe this. And those Ukrainian nationalists have a very different role in in Ukrainian historiography than they do in Polish historiography. So that's a very current issue, because there's the question of the exhumation and reburial of the victims of the Wołyń massacre, which is still, a point of difference between Poland and Ukraine. And as a historian, obviously, Mr. Nawrocki feels this very sensitively, this issue. But there are also socio-economic questions, and the most important of these is agriculture, where Poland feels that it faces unfair competition from Ukrainian farmers, and feels that Polish farmers need protecting. They don't want to give unlimited access to EU markets, because they will to Ukrainian farmers, they will undercut Polish farmers, who they feel are face unfair competition. And Mr. Nawrocki's argument is that Poland, while it should support Ukraine in this overarching struggle against Russia, it needs to be more assertive in those areas where Poland and Ukraine's interests are different. Indeed, he argues that Poland needs to leverage the fact that Ukraine needs Poland and its support in the military, diplomatic, humanitarian sphere in order to make progress on those issues where their interests are different. So it's much more conditional, it's much more instrumental. And flowing from that, Mr. Nawrocki has, for example, made it clear that he is very skeptical about Polish opposition to about Ukrainian accession to the EU and indeed to NATO. He's actually been quite unequivocal about Ukrainian accession to NATO. In order to get support of Confederation voters and Mr. Menson, he actually signed a statement saying he would oppose this. He's a bit more equivocal about the EU, but with that, he also argues that Poland should use the EU accession negotiations in order to leverage its position on those issues where the two countries are in disagreement. So I think this is an important difference. Basically, it's a much more kind of the basic policy is the same in terms of supporting Ukraine. There's no support for Putin or the Putin narrative, but it's much more instrumental and Trumpian, some people would say. Basically leveraging the fact that Ukraine needs Poland in order to advance Poland's interests in those areas where they clash with Ukraine's.
In recent decades, Central Europe has been a fertile ground for different sub-regional cooperation platforms, in which Poland has also taken a prominent role, an active role. In your opinion, will Nawrocki try to give an impetus to the Visegrad 4, for example, which proves to be a very useful tool in mutually assisting the four, at the start 3 and then four countries way back to Europe, NATO, EU structures, integration, etc. Or maybe we prefer other platforms over the Visegrad 4, such as the Weimar Triangle or the Three Seas Initiative, which is clearly a Polish project or has been a Polish project since its inception. What do you think?
I think it's worth locating Mr. Nawrocki's approach within the broader law and justice approach to what they believe is the most effective way of advancing Poland's EU interests and the difference that they have with the way that the current government is approaching those advancing those interests. The current government strategy is very much in favor of trying to work as closely with what you might call the European mainstream. Okay, so these are the major EU powers, particularly Berlin. This is the EU political establishment. Their argument is Poland needs to locate itself within that European mainstream, which means having very close relations with those countries and those political forces, which means the corollary of which means that, for example, they're quite keen to revive something like the Weimar Triangle international cooperation platform. Law and Justice's approach is very different. Their argument is that there are some issues where Poland and Poland's interests and those of the major European powers, particularly Germany, clash. And therefore, in order to advance its interests within the EU, Poland needs to build alternative alliances. I mean, Mr. Duda used to use this phrase, Poland needs to develop its own stream, not just to work within the mainstream. And cooperation with other post-communist states was an absolutely critical element of that. That was Poland wanted to kind of pitch itself as a regional leader working with other post-communist states. And I think Mr. Nawrocki will be very committed to reviving that project. I think the Three Seas Initiative in particular is something that this was something Mr. Duda started. He will be keen to try and revive. And I think it's worth noting the Three Seas Initiative was really put on the map when Donald Trump came to one of their conferences. And I think that that would be a way that Mr. Nawrocki might, for example, try and leverage the good contacts that he has with the White House to try and revive that as a cooperation platform. I mean, obviously, there are other very practical elements about this in terms of infrastructure and energy cooperation, which falls short of an alternative alliance within the EU. But that was definitely part of the project that Law and Justice, Mr. Duda, were promoting in terms of the 3 Cs initiative, and I think Mr. Nawrocki will continue. The Visegrad 4, I think, is a really interesting one. So originally, the Visegrad 4 was seen as an absolutely key instrument in terms of building an alternative foreign policy axis within the EU. The Polish and Hungarian governments worked very, very closely together after Law and Justice came to office in 2015. They kind of defended each other openly in EU institutions. And indeed, the 4 countries had worked quite closely together in opposing the migrant relocation scheme in 2015. Which was so it was obviously a project that brought those 4 countries together, working as an alliance within the EU, and particularly after the Law and Justice took office in 2015. I think that the Visegrad Group become very problematic there were a number of reasons. A change in government in the Czech Republic, but I think the most important one were obviously very big differences in terms of the Polish and Hungarian government's approaches to the war in Ukraine. And at that point, I think the Visegrad 4 became something of a dead letter in terms of being a vehicle through which Poland tried to advance its EU interest. The interesting question is what will happen under Mr. Nawrocki. There's an opportunity here for a reset. He's not Mr. Duda. He's, as you say, got a somewhat different take in terms of the war in Ukraine. Obviously, he's not got the same take as the Hungarian government, or indeed the Slovak government of Robert Fico. But he's not such an unconditional supporter of Ukraine as was Mr. Duda. So and obviously time has passed. Basically a lot of those the issues that were felt to be exceptionally divisive in 2022 when the Visegrad Group effectively stopped functioning as any meaningful thing may well have passed. So I think that's a very interesting question, and it's tricky to know what's going to happen to that. I think it's genuinely uncertain where Mr. Nawrocki will go on this. He will want to revive the post-communist states cooperation forums. He will do this definitely with the 3 Cs initiative. Whether he does it with the Visegrad 4 or not, we shall see. It certainly was very important at one time, instrument for law and justice. We'll see. I think that's a very interesting question, beyond that, I don't think I could speculate any more on that.
And my final question would continue on your thoughts about the Warsaw-Budapest axis, and also the international party relations or party alliance here in Europe. Hungarian PM Viktor Orbán praised Nawrocki's win as a huge success of the Patriot camp in Europe, despite the fact that PiS is in the ECR group, while Fidesz has established with other parties the Patriots for Europe last year in the European Parliament. Can right-wing, say, populist parties profit from PiS and Nawrocki's win? Maybe it's a kind of resurrection of PiS, or at least showing signs of being back on the political scene. What do you think?
Okay, sure. So I suppose first thing I'll say is that it's sort of a nitpicky point. I don't really like using the word populist. I don't use that. Yeah. I tend to use the word in the insurgent right. Okay, this is so that's. But I think we sort of know what we're talking about. So the insurgent right. So I think the first thing to say is that if you look around Europe and the United States, the kind of in a sense, what you're sort of seeing playing out in the Polish election is now what is increasingly the defining line of political conflict in many countries. Okay, and that is between what you might call the insurgent right and for want of a better term, the kind of the liberal establishment, if you like, and by the liberal establishment includes political forces that are on the center right, so kind of the sort of traditional center right, Christian democratic or post-democratic forces. You've got parties on the social democratic left and parties of the kind of the liberal center, and increasingly you find that these forces are aligned against the challenger on the insurgent right, and that's where the kind of the political energy is on the political right. The traditional centre right is, it comes and goes in various places, but it's kind of slowly being pushed aside, and it's very often quite similar electoral constituencies that are being mobilised as well. I mean, very often this kind of the new insurgent right does appeal to less well-off voters, people living in smaller towns and rural areas. So these are it's kind of similar social constituencies. The issues, I think, are somewhat different. I mean, in Poland, it's religiosity. These kind of moral, cultural issues are probably more important. In other countries, issues like migration, I would say, are probably more significant in terms of, I guess, cultural issues as mobilizers. But broadly speaking, I think these are the political forces around which competition seems to be organizing. The insurgent right versus everybody else. Broadly speaking, the liberal establishment, to say, for want of a better term. So I think that's one thing where that's something that Poland has in common with lots of other countries. I think I'm very wary about looking at particular elections and saying that this is the harbinger of a political trend. Okay, beyond that overall trend of these are the two sets of forces around which competition is developing. The reason being is because very often what happens in a particular election, in a particular country, tells you more about, where you are in the political cycle in that country than it does about, what's happening, about some kind of, international or global wave. I mean, Law and Justice lost the 2023 election mainly because he had been in office for 8 years, and people who, were simply fed up with it. They wanted a change. They found a way of, voting for a change, which didn't involve voting for Donald Tusk. Actually, they actually won more votes than, Donald Tusk's party. People didn't want them back particularly, but, they found a way of sort of channeling that in opposition parties in a way that meant that they lost. Mr. Nawrocki's victory tells us that the Tusk government is very, very unpopular. Okay, people are fed up with it. People want to use the election as an opportunity to channel that discontent. So I caution about looking at a particular election results in particular countries and trying to identify it as some kind of wave. I mean, I suppose the only partial exception I would say here is, I mean, if you have an election result in a big country which attracts a lot of publicity and a lot of interest, that can create debates that spill over into other countries. Okay, so for example, I mean, Donald Trump's victory in the United States is the biggest country in the world. The most powerful country in the world. I mean, you can't help. But it can't help but influence the kind of political debates that are happening in other countries. And Poland is, a relatively big European country. It's fifth largest member of the EU. It's the biggest country in East Central Europe. So obviously the spillover from who wins the Polish presidential election in terms of debates in other countries is going to be the bigger than, and I immediately apologize to any Slovenians or Lithuanians, but say the result of the Slovenian or the Lithuanian presidential elections. Nothing again, very interesting politics in both of those countries, but unfortunately not many people other than me notice what's going on in those countries, whereas lots of people notice what's happening in Poland. So as I say, I think that don't think of these things in terms of kind of big waves. There's a right-wing wave sweeping across Europe or whatever, just as there wasn't a sort of an anti-insurgent wave sweeping across Europe in 2023 when Mr. Tusk won. It's, journalists find it they look at elections as a kind of, world series, if you like, and, who's winning this one, who's winning that one. It's very often to do with the electoral cycle in that country, where you've reached to it, the popularity of the incumbent or the government. But having said all that, the political forces that Law and Justice and the two sides, if you like, in Poland represent, you can find across Europe now. These are increasingly the key political forces, and what happens in Poland will have an impact, beyond Poland in terms of influencing debates, if not necessarily, fundamentally changing political cycles.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this insightful discussion. I can confidently say that this has been probably the best I have ever had within our podcast series. So thank you for being with us today.
You're very kind, and it was an enormous pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor. And dear listeners, thank you for listening to our podcast episode on the Polish presidential election with Professor Szczerbiak. Please subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for the upcoming episodes. Goodbye, everyone.